There is a belief you have carried since childhood, so deeply rooted that you have never stopped to question it. The belief that life and death are opposites. That on one side there is everything, and on the other, absolute nothingness. But what if that belief is wrong? What if death is not the end of life, but simply the end of one specific way of experiencing it? Think about what that means for you right now. So many of your choices, your fears, the things you avoid, and the things you cling to, all of it was shaped by an interpretation that was never questioned, an interpretation that may not be true. Today, you are going to look at death in a way you may have never considered. Not as theology, not as comfort, but as an honest investigation into what science, philosophy, and the deepest spiritual traditions point to when they are taken seriously. And what they point to is unsettling, liberating, and more coherent than anything you were taught in school. If you keep watching, something will shift. Not necessarily what you believe, but the way you feel the time you have. We have all lost someone. And in that moment of loss, the first thing we feel is not only grief, it is a kind of absurdity. How can someone who was here, who spoke, who laughed, who had plans, simply no longer be? The mind cannot fully process it. And perhaps that's because the mind, at some deep level, already knows that total disappearance is not the right answer. That something in that equation doesn't add up. No human being is born afraid of death. Young children don't carry that anguish. What they have is a survival instinct, which is something entirely different, the existential fear of death, the kind that wakes you up at 3 a.m, that paralyzes decisions, that turns aging into a threat. That fear is learned. It is built up in layers through culture, religion, language, and accumulated experiences over a lifetime. Every time someone around you treated death as the worst possible outcome, another brick was added to that wall. And today, that wall is so high that most people can't even see over it. The way a culture treats death reveals something profound about what it believes about life. Societies that hide the dead, that don't speak about the end, that medicalize the dying process until it becomes invisible. Those societies produce people who live in chronic denial. And denial carries a very high cost. It prevents people from living fully, because living fully requires accepting that this body, in this form, is not permanent. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called this being toward death. The idea that recognizing our finitude is what gives urgency and depth to existence. When we ignore death, we also ignore life. And now comes the part that almost no one considers. The fear of death is not only a personal fear, it is an extraordinarily efficient mechanism of social control. When people are afraid to die, they are easier to convince, to manipulate, to keep within established boundaries. The promise of security, whether physical, financial, or spiritual, has always had the fear of the end as its backdrop. Recognizing this is not simple, it is clarity. Because when you begin to question the cultural construction of the fear of death, you also begin to question which of your choices are truly yours and which were made in response to a fear that may not need to exist the way it does. In the previous video, we explored the idea that consciousness may not be produced by the brain, but only expressed through it. If that's true, then one question becomes inevitable. What happens to consciousness when the brain stops functioning? The conventional answer is, it disappears. But that answer assumes consciousness is a product of the brain. If it isn't, then the equation changes completely. Just as turning off a radio doesn't destroy the transmission passing through it, turning off the brain may not destroy the consciousness that was expressing itself through it. Dr. Ping van Lommel, whom we mentioned before, published a study with more than 300 patients who had near-death experiences during cardiac arrests. What these patients reported were not disconnected hallucinations. They were structured, coherent experiences with access to information that could not have been obtained by the brain in that state. Patients who described in detail conversations that took place in the operating room while they were unconscious. Patients who saw objects placed in locations they had no way of knowing about. Van Lommel is not a mystic. He is a rigorous cardiologist, and his conclusions were published in the medical journal The Lancet. He concluded that consciousness appears to be non-local, meaning not confined to the brain. But that's only the beginning. If consciousness is non-local, then it does not begin with birth and does not end with death. It simply changes its form of expression. This resonates with what spiritual traditions from completely different cultures have been saying for millennia. From the Hindu concept of Atman, the eternal self behind the temporary personality, to the Buddhist concept of the continuity of consciousness between existences, to the early Christian idea that what is eternal in us is not the physical body. These traditions arrived at similar conclusions through completely different paths. And when different paths lead to the same place, it is worth asking whether that place is not in some way real. Imagine you have spent your entire life inside a room. The room has windows, and through the windows you see the world. One day, the door of the room opens. You have never seen a door before. To someone on the outside, you simply vanish from the room. But you didn't vanish. You left. This metaphor is imperfect, as all metaphors are, but it captures something important. The difference between disappearing and transitioning. Death, seen through this lens, is not an extinction. It is a change of context. The you that existed inside the room is not destroyed. It simply finds itself in a larger space. This idea of transition has practical implications that go far beyond philosophy. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent decades working with terminally ill patients, describes something consistent across their accounts. In the moments leading up to death, many of them reported a growing sense of expansion, not contraction, an opening, not a closing. She documented this with clinical rigor across dozens of cases, not as definitive proof of anything, but as data that cannot be ignored. The process of dying, for many who passed through it and returned to tell it, did not feel like an extinction. It felt like a crossing. And now comes the part that almost no one considers. If death is a transition and not an end, then the way we live needs to change. Because most people live as though everything must be accumulated in this one existence, as if there were no continuity whatsoever. This creates an anxiety of scarcity that permeates almost everything. The race for status, for material security, for recognition. Much of it is fueled by the fear that if not now, then never. But if consciousness continues, then this specific life is not the only opportunity. It is one opportunity, one particular expression. And that doesn't diminish its importance. In fact, it deepens it. Because when you are not acting out of desperation, you can act out of love. If death is not the opposite of life, then what is? The answer that emerges when you go deeper into this investigation is surprisingly simple. The opposite of death is birth. Both are events within life. Life is a larger process that contains them. You were not born into life. You were born within life. And in the same way, you do not die out of life. You transition within it. This inversion changes everything. Because if life is the larger field, then you have never been outside of it. And you never will be. This perspective transforms what we understand by identity. We typically identify the self with this body, this story, this name. But if consciousness is continuous and the body is only one of its temporary expressions, then identity is something far vaster and far more resilient than we imagine. Carl Jung described the process of individuation as a movement toward the self, the greater wholeness that includes but surpasses the ego. This process, he suggested, does not end with physical death. It continues because what is in process is not the body. It is consciousness. But there is something even deeper. Redefining life this way has an immediate and very concrete consequence. It changes your relationship with the present. When you believe everything ends with the death of the body, the present becomes something to be compulsively exploited, or something to be postponed in favor of a future that never arrives. But when you recognize that the present is an expression of the larger life and not all of life, something eases, not in the sense of passivity, in the sense of depth. You begin to inhabit moments differently, with less anxious urgency and more genuine attention. Because this moment, this exact moment, doesn't have to be everything. It only has to be real. The fear of death, when examined closely, is often the fear of losing what you have built, what you love, what you are. But if what you truly are does not end with the body, then what exactly are you afraid of losing? This doesn't eliminate grief. It doesn't eliminate the pain of loss, but it removes from fear its power to paralyze. And a human being who does not act from fear acts in an entirely different way. If you are not only this body and this story, then who you are has a depth that goes far beyond what the mirror shows and what a resume describes. You are an expression of something that did not begin with your birth and will not end with your death. This is not empty consolation. It is a radical reconfiguration of where you look for meaning. Facing death with honesty, without denial, and without dramatization is one of the most courageous acts available to a human being. Not because death stops being real, but because when you look it in the eye, it loses its power to govern your choices through guilt, fear, and anxious urgency. And you reclaim something precious, the freedom to live for deeper reasons. We cling because we fear final loss. But if final loss does not exist in the way we imagine, then attachment begins to transform into something different. Not indifference, not distance, but a love that doesn't need to possess in order to be real. A presence that doesn't need to last forever in order to matter. When life is only this interval between birth and death, purpose becomes a race against time. But when life is the larger field, purpose becomes something that can be lived with more stillness, more depth, and more alignment with what you truly are. Not what fear wants you to be, what consciousness, in its clearest moments, already knows you are. We have reached the end of this journey, but the question that remains has no end. If death is not the opposite of life, then what is life after all? If consciousness continues beyond the body, what are you doing with that consciousness right now? If this moment is not all there is, how do you want to inhabit it? Perhaps the greatest transformation this idea can bring is not about what happens after death. It's about what you do before, about how you treat the people you love while you still can, about which fears you decide to stop obeying, about which versions of yourself you decide to let go. And if that's true, then there is something even more pressing to investigate. What exactly happens in the moment of transition? What do near-death accounts, contemplative traditions, and modern physics say about the threshold between what we call life and what we call death? That is what we will explore in the next video. If this video moves something in you, you don't need a big reaction. Just let the idea work. Come back to it when you feel the need. And if you want to continue this path together, subscribe to the channel. Every video here is one piece of a larger investigation. Leave a comment. What shifts in you when you consider that death may not be an end? I want to read what this stirs in you. Until the next video.